No, that's the
Good?
same page.
No worries. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. No, it's 3 pages.
Really? Sorry. Oh, you wanted to find. You were better than me. Thank you.
There we go. All right. Yes, well, since 2/3 of...
We need to remember, we forget the child what.
Well, also since 2/3 of the shiur this morning, I'll probably see again tomorrow morning.
Yes.
So I can't repeat the same thing. So it's good that tomorrow's shiur is about the... exactly, it's about the 9 days. All right, what I thought we'd do is have a look at Parashat Matot and the themes, which I think in some way we can all connect, or can connect all of them together, especially the last two. So first of all, this week's, Matot I must say, but this week, Parashat Matot, basically there are 3 themes to Parashat Matot. The first is the concept of Ishki Yidor Neder La Hashem, the beginning of the parsha. The beginning of the parsha is all about those who make a vow, make a promise. People shouldn't think that kind of thing is just sort of empty words, that there's actually repercussions for someone who can't fulfill the promise, that something that you commit to is not just something that you can pull out of when it's inconvenient for you, that the words that you say and the promises that you make really matter. So that's the first theme. The second theme is the spoils of war, from the war with Midian and how they were divided once they defeated Midian. And the third theme, which probably is the most well known, is the request of the 2.5 tribes. Who are the 2.5 tribes? Reuven, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. That they actually, hi Melanie, that they request from Moshe to settle on the other side of the Jordan, not to go with the people or the rest of the Jewish people to conquer and inhabit the other side of the Jordan, and the whole discussion that ensues then between them and Moshe's I would even say disgust that they think that they don't have to participate in the wars of the Jewish people, that they'll stay on the other side of the Jordan and won't enter the land of Israel. And we'll see what disturbs him the most about their request. But first of all, let's have a look at the second theme that I mentioned, which is the idea of the dividing of the spoils from the war with Midian. So if you look, it's the first source on the page. You should have 3 pages in front of you. The first is the spoils, the topic at the top, the spoils of war. The Torah, or the people are commanded. Good morning, how are you? You know, you don't have to sit so far away, but you're welcome to. People are scared. Oh, usual places. All good. Okay. The people are commanded. You and Elazar, I'll read it. You know what? I'll read it in Hebrew and in English. It's from the Bamidbar Lamed Aleph, Psukim Chafav and Chav Zayin. Sa'id Rosh Malkoach Hashvi Ba'adam V'Beima, Ata ve'Elazar HaKohen v'Roshei Avot HaIda. וחצית את המלכוח בין תופסי המלחמה יוצאים לצבא ובין כל העדה. You and Elazar the priest, this is after the war, and how will they divide up the spoils of victory? They're told, you and Elazar the priest and the family, heads of the community, take an inventory. In other words, take a list, make a list of the spoils that were captured, man and beast, and divide the spoils equally between the combatants who engaged in the campaign and the rest of the community. So what is interesting here in the commandment to divide up the spoils of war? Well, that's just talking about the people they captured, there were animals that they captured. That in those days was not really that unusual. But the fact that there is even a commandment around it. Okay? Even today. Unfortunately, with, I guess, less moral armies. It's you just take, the soldiers are welcome to take whatever spoils they can find, or whatever people or house or anything that they capture. The Torah tells us already thousands of years ago that when the Jewish people defeated their enemies, it wasn't just a free-for-all. You couldn't just walk into a house and each soldier and each person take what they wanted and take the riches for themselves, but instead they're commanded by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're commanded by God. You have to, right, that Moshe and Elazar were to take an inventory of the booty. So in other words, there was a list that was made of all the spoils that were captured, man and beast, so actually make a list of what was captured and then divide them equally. And when they divide them equally between the combatants who engaged in the campaign and the rest of the community. In other words, who is it being divided up between?
It's equal.
Equal between who though?
The soldiers who fought the war and
Everybody. Okay, everybody is, everybody has a share in the, everybody has a share in the spoils of war that were taken and that were taken as part of this victory, which is interesting that already thousands of years ago the Torah talks about, even when we do have to go to war, and even when there is thank God, our enemies are vanquished and we defeat our enemies. You can't just decide to give whatever you like to whoever you like. There's actually a procedure, and not only is there a procedure amongst the people who are in combat, but actually all of the Jewish people need to feel that they have a part in this war, even the ones who are not actually part of the battle. Even so, for example, when I was in the army, in the IDF, often the people who were not combat soldiers, so we were in a combat unit, and attached to each combat unit is a chef, and many other jobs which are not, which are more technical, right? Whether that's someone who's storing things in the shed or someone who's cooking the meals, and often the people who are not actually combat soldiers were looked down upon, right? It's as if they're not actually risking their lives, so they're not as worthy, they're not as good. In fact, one of the chefs actually became a chef because in one of the wars, as they were entering and crossing over the border into Lebanon, he actually couldn't do it. It was just too hard for him mentally to go to battle, and he actually sat on the border and refused to move. Does it often happen? Look, I don't know the statistics, but it's a huge thing to do. Often you're carried with the rest of so there's obviously a lot of fear inside of you, but often you're carried with the rest of I don't know if I'd call it peer pressure, but it's definitely true that when you feel like there's a whole lot of other people doing the same thing as you and behind you, etc., they sort of push you over the line. Obviously, someone who tells you that they weren't scared at all is just lying. But I think often it's the fact that you're doing it with a group of people, and why should they risk their lives and not you? Or you feel this sort of positive energy and adrenaline that sort of pushes you over the line. And I'm definitely not judging anyone who did what this guy does. But the point I'm trying to make is that even today. And also my experience in the army were those who couldn't fight for one reason or another were looked down upon, whereas the Torah's instruction after the victory is no. The spoils of war are not just divided up between the people who fought, but actually we're a nation, we're one, there's unity, everyone needs to feel that they're a part of this journey, and therefore not only do you have to make a list and divide it up, that division is not just between the people who fought, but between everyone who's part of Am Yisrael, who's part of the Jewish people. And I now want to show you that this kind of instruction is followed also later on in Tanakh, and to have a look at a story in Tanakh that involves David HaMelech, involves King David and his war against Amalek. In merit of the community, what do you mean?
So yes, the army waged the battle and they won, but had the community not merited?
Yes, it's definitely true that part of what the Torah is trying to teach us is that everybody plays a part, 100%. You're right, okay, and it's definitely true, like the example I was giving before, that everybody, not just everybody, shares the load or plays a part in it, whether that's the person who makes the meals or the person who goes out to fight.
Or if you put on tefillin, for example.
If you put on tefillin as well, everybody, whether that's spiritually or physically, has a role in the war. And so that I 100% agree with you. That's part of what the Torah, I think, is trying to point out. And now we're going to have a look at a story of David HaMelech, of King David, from the book of Shmuel. I'll read it in Hebrew and English again. People are welcome to follow along in whatever language they feel comfortable with. So, the book of Shmuel tells us, Vayelech David hu v'sheshmot ish asher ito. This is a war that King David is fighting with his men. Vayavo nachal absor v'notarim amadu. Vayidov David. So basically, what's happening here is that the Amalekites. So the Amalekites historically were always some kind of. They didn't have a specific place that they weren't a nation in the traditional sense. That they didn't have a land. Would you like source sheet?
Thank you.
It's all right, I'll come and give it to you. There we go.
Thanks.
And basically they've taken a whole lot of people, including two of David HaMelech, King David's wives, captive, and David HaMelech and his men are chasing after them. And Vayidov David, it's Pasuk Yud, right at the end of the first page. Vayidov David hu va'arba mayot ish v'ya'amdu 200 ish asher pigru me'avor et nachal habsor. So David and the 600 men with him set out. Turn over the page. And they and 200 men had halted too faint to cross the Wadi Besor. It seems, and we'll keep reading basically to see what happens, but the interesting thing here, which I wanted to point out, is that there are two, David HaMelech, King David is chasing after, I think some part of the sentence also got cut off, by the way, so my apologies, but if you look already at the top of the second page, what I'm trying to point out is that once again, we have a situation, or not once again, but in this particular situation, King David is chasing after an enemy. That enemy has taken people captive, and yet there are 200 men, like we spoke about before, people who stopped on the border, but there are 200 men who can't actually cross over the wadi because they're too tired, right? The Tanakh tells us too faint to cross. Now let's have a look and see what happens the rest of the story. Renee, what do you think happens at the rest of the story, if you were to take a guess? Let's have a look.
I was thinking.
They what?
They said, of course, we'll come and fight, but when we come back, can we give up?
Oh well, that's this week's parasha. That's a completely different story. This is a story of King David in the book of Shmuel, the book of Samuel. We will come back to the 2.5 tribes in this week's parasha as well, and the connection to that. This is a completely different story. This is a story of King David chasing after Amalek. Amalek's crossed the Wadi Besor, the Tanakh tells us, and David is chasing after them with his men. But 200 of them get to a point where they can't continue. They're too faint. Sorry?
Does he leave them behind for that?
Well, he has no choice but to leave them behind because they don't want to keep going. Okay, this is not. By the way, this is not a war to conquer land. It's a war to basically take back what has been taken captive. David took all the flocks and herds which the troops drove ahead of the other livestock, and they declared, "This is David's spoil." When David reached the 200 men who were too faint to follow David, who had been left at the Wadi Besor, they came out to welcome David and the troops with him. David came forward with the troops and greeted them. So I should have told you this before, but I left out over here a whole lot of sentences, which basically I asked Renee what she thought happened. Basically, David HaMelech chases after the Amalekites. He defeats them in victory. He takes back all the captives, including his 2 wives that were taken captive. And he also obviously has spoils of war. Now they're coming back Right, they're returning, and obviously when they're returning, they meet the 200 men who had been too faint to cross over and continue chasing after the Amalekites with King David. Is everyone following the story? Okay, so this is what's happened. When David reached the 200 men, sentence number 21, let's see what happens. When David reached the 200 men who were too faint to follow David, and who had been left at the Wadi Besor, they came out to welcome David and the troops with him. David came forward with the troops and greeted them. But all the mean and churlish is interesting. Anyone know what churlish actually means? Yeah, they're in a bad mood, I think. Anyway, it's an interesting translation, but it's interesting to see if anyone actually knows what that word means. But basically, they're quite angry at the people who had stayed behind. Among the men who had accompanied David spoke up. Since they did not accompany us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we seized, except that each may take his wife and children and go. So in other words, they say to David, absolutely not. These people didn't follow us into battle. It's not happening. Right? There's no way that after we risked our lives and now we come back with the spoils of victory, there's no way that you're dividing the spoils between them as well. We're not going to punish them. They can go home to their families, but don't think that they're getting any of the spoils. Is that fair?
We're not sharing.
Sorry? We're not sharing. Is that fair? Well, think about if you were in that situation, what you would do.
I'll sit back, let them go wage the war, and I'm going to benefit anyway, so why worry?
Okay, so let's see what David HaMelech does. Let's see what King David does. David, however, okay, and once again we seem to have a sentence which has been cut off, but basically David decides, if you turn over the page, David decides that no, that actually the spoils have to be divided between everyone. How could, sentence number 24, how could anyone agree with you in this matter? The share of those who remain with the baggage shall be the same as share of those who go down to battle, they shall share alike. So from that day on, it was made a fixed rule for Israel, continuing to the present day. So David HaMelech says to his troops, and he probably lost a lot of credibility as well, because these people are saying, well, if I'd known that, I would have stayed on the other side. Right? I didn't realize that it was all, you could just stay on the other side and still share in the spoils of battle. But David HaMelech, King David points out to them, no. Right? Just like we see in this week's parasha, although he doesn't quote from this week's parasha, but just like we see in this week's parasha, everybody shares equally in the spoils of war, and it cannot be that others benefit more, so some benefit more than others. And obviously, as you can imagine, they're not particularly happy with that situation, but David HaMelech makes it very clear to them that that's the rule, and not only that, the Tanakh tells us, so from that day on, it was made a fixed rule for Israel, continuing to the present day. Now, my question is the following, and once I ask it, I'm going to have a sip of my cup of coffee and listen to your answers. What are the reasons for dividing up something equally, and not just equally, but between all the people? If you're a military strategist, I'm not talking now necessarily from a perspective of what the Torah tells us, but if you're leading a people into war, or leading a team into war, or a unit, what is the thought behind dividing it equally?
I'm thinking of Israel today, and I'm fighting this for the land, for the people, for the whatever. So maybe does that extend to spoils? I mean, spoils today are different from what we have now.
Correct.
I think, yes.
Yep. Well, today they don't take.
And fighting for our survival.
But so I think that there are two. There are.
That's the question then.
Okay, so what is the reason? And I'll make it easier. Maybe I wasn't specific enough. I think there are two different ways to look at this idea of the spoils of victory and dividing them equally between the people. One is ethical, and I think we've touched on that a little bit, but the other one is also tactical. it's not just an ethical decision to divide it up between the people, it's also a tactical one.
If it's tactical, it's like there's a benefit to the whole people.
So they wouldn't get jealous of each other?
From a tactical perspective, if you say that you basically risk people just going off and doing whatever they like. If each soldier is allowed to walk into the house, take whatever they like, then you can often lose control of what the soldiers are doing. If everyone knows that anything which you take has to be equally divided between everyone, it creates a lot more sort of law and order amongst the troops. So I think there's also a tactical perspective involved in this story, and also Sorry? Yeah, correct. It's a form of discipline, but obviously, as we know, the Torah takes it one step further and says it's not just about the troops, it's actually divided amongst the entire people of Israel, because everyone needs to feel that they have a share in what's going on. So that's one part of the parasha. The other part of the parasha is, as we know, and like I said, probably the most well-known part of the parasha, of Parashat Matot at least, which is the story of Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh. What is that story? What do Reuven, Gad, and Manasseh want?
They want to stay on the other side of the
Why?
Because it's fertile.
Because it's fertile. Okay? And they come to Moshe, 100% correct, and they come to Moshe and they say, we'd like to stay on the other side of the Jordan. What is Moshe's response?
They're not falling apart and fighting the wars or protecting the land.
Okay, anyone else?
They have to
Being selfish.
go to battle, but then they make them go back.
They have to go to battle, but afterwards they can come back. Okay. Often people, so you're saying what I think is definitely true, and definitely the response that Moshe gives them, but often people focus more on this idea of them being selfish and not agreeing to settle the land of Israel and not being like everybody else. But actually, I think if you look at the Psukim, Moshe's biggest problem with the people was not necessarily that, but rather the concept of battle and the concept of everybody has to play a part. So what does Moshe say to them? If you have a look, and it's the last source on the page. Vayomer Moshe livnei Gad v'livnei Reuven ha'achtechem yavo lamilchama va'atem teshvu po. Right? Which is, Moshe replies to Gad and Reuven, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? A very sharp rebuke of the people. He's saying to them, how can it be that everybody else has to take part in risking their lives, and you guys think you can just stay here and basically set up shop over here in a fertile land and do whatever you like whilst your brothers are fighting? That's what Moshe is most angry about. There are other parts that I think frustrate him, that he feels that they don't necessarily understand the goal and purpose of what they've been doing up until now. But Moshe's biggest complaint against the people, I think, is this pasuk, and the very sharp way in which he says it to them. How can it be that your brothers are going to go to war?
But it exists today. The same thing.
Does it?
The people that are learning and studying and whatever, I mean, everything is there and others are out there fighting. Is it different?
I'm not going to go into that now, especially because I'm being recorded. But I'm not sure it's exactly the same thing. But I think that Moshe's, let's put it this way: Moshe's frustration and anger at the people is a feeling that they aren't sharing the burden of pulling their weight. And that, I think, is directly connected to the previous topic, and the previous topic in the parasha, where the spoils were equally divided between everyone. Because Moshe's goal for the people is that they all feel that they're part of the journey. They all feel part of what's going on, and they all feel that they're equally. That doesn't mean that everyone is doing exactly the same thing, and that everybody has to have exactly the same level of whatever it is. But everybody has to feel that they're doing their bit and using their strengths to further the cause of the Jewish people. And if there's a group of people, in fact 2.5 tribes, that feel that we can just stay here, and it even crosses their mind that that's something that, right, because often we only ask things that we know we can get away with. If something is so ridiculous, we often don't even ask the question. Moshe is so upset that these people think that they don't, like, that they can sort of separate themselves from the rest of the people, that's what I think his main anger and frustration is. Where they choose to live at the end of the day, after Kibush Haaretz, after they've conquered the land, actually, yes, that does frustrate him, but not as much as the fact that we're all in this together, we all need to pull our weight, and you guys, from what you're asking me, you're showing me that you don't really understand that. Any questions?
What happened to Menashe? Why did
Menashe is part of it too, because that he didn't come with the initial request, but and it's also not the whole tribe, by the way, and half of the tribe of Menashe. But that's a good question as well. But I also want to point out something else, which is that we have to remember that almost 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago we read which parasha? I think, or 2.5 weeks ago. It took me a while to work out, so I shouldn't expect people to tell me. Parashat Chukat. And in Parashat Chukat, something remarkable happens. And that is that we basically skip 39 years in a few paragraphs. The first part of the Sefer Bamidbar, of the book of Bamidbar, Naso B'Halotcha, right? The people are getting ready to go into the land of Israel. And then what happens? We have Parashat Shlach. And what happens in Parashat Shlach? Sorry? Exactly, the spies. So what happens as a result of the spies?
They stay longer.
Exactly. There's no more preparation to go into the land of Israel because they're stuck. They're not going anywhere. They're being punished. They're staying for the next while, and they're basically dying. That generation is dying out in the desert. In Chukat, we basically have this transition where there's a whole lot of years which are skipped. There's a whole lot of years which are skipped in a very short amount of time, and that is what happens basically in Chukat. That after Chukat we have the wars that the Jewish people fight already when they're in the desert. So we have Balak also, who tries to curse the Jewish people. What happens after he fails to curse the Jewish people? He brings non-Jewish women to try and seduce them, and to a certain extent that works. We have Pinchas, but Balak, Pinchas, and Matot Maseh, which we're reading this week, are all really a new generation. It's a new generation of people which are basically very, very different to the generation of their parents, because they realize one important thing, that there is a big difference between what they're going to have to do in Kibush Haaretz and conquering the land of Israel and going out to fight, and not relying solely on the divine protection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because remember, in the desert, that's basically what was happening, right? You have the cloud of glory that was protecting them, the water came miraculously, the mud came from heaven, everything was there for them. Yetziat Mitzrayim, you think about the exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the sea, it was all done for them. Comes Chukat, and comes sort of the second half of the book of Bamidbar, and it's completely different. The people are a different people. They're not the generation of their parents. They understand that what happened to their parents and the way in which their parents were protected is not what's going to happen to them. And so therefore, they sometimes fight wars by themselves without necessarily consulting with Moshe. They're much more independent. You have the daughters of Tzlofchad, right, who question the concept or ask Moshe, right, our father didn't have any sons, why should we be sort of prevented from taking his inheritance. They're people who are much more independent in their thinking, and also understand the fact that when they go into the land of Israel, obviously there's divine protection, but not in the same way that was happening in the desert. Why is all of that important to the discussion here, and to the spoils of war, and to the story of the Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh? Because once again, the people are independent, and the people now understand that they have to do things for themselves. But along with that, that means that they can no longer, up until now, or up until the sort of next generation, the people, whether or not each person felt that they were sort of part of something bigger, and they were doing their bit for the Jewish people, probably wasn't as important, because at the end of the day, Hashem yilachem lachem va'atem tacharishun, as Hashem tells Moshe right before the splitting of the sea. Hashem in many cases fought the wars for them, made miracles for them. It was all, in a lot of cases, being done for them. They were a generation of slaves that come out of Egypt and then sort of are taken care of by God. The next generation, no. The next generation, they're the ones who are going to be called upon to do a lot of the work. Yes, there are miracles when Yeshua enters the land of Israel, but definitely not to the same extent that we know about from the book of Shemot, from the book of Bamidbar. It's not as divine, it's not as miraculous, and the people are expected to take care of themselves, to divide up the land. I mean, obviously with the divine instruction, but they have to do it. Okay, you look at after Yoshua in the book of Shoftim, right, where the people are this total anarchy and the people are just doing whatever they like, whenever they like. God doesn't give the same protection to the people once they enter the land of Israel. They're expected, obviously, with divine, Hashem's always looking after all of us, and especially his eyes are always on the land of Israel, but it's not the same thing. It's not the generation that came out of the desert, and therefore there is a big emphasis placed in this week's parasha. I think that's the overall theme. Don't know how exactly we fit in the first part of Ishki or Nedel Hashem, the concept of a vow and being careful about what you say, but definitely the last two themes, the spoil of war, the spoils of victory, and this idea that all the tribes have to be involved in the war, in the conquest of the land of Israel, is that everyone plays their part, and everybody has to do something to be part of this mission, which is the Jewish people's entry or preparation now for entry into the land of Israel. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the very important instruction which is given, that it's not necessarily based on how much you think or how each and every person, the combat soldier, is just as important as the person who's preparing the meals. In other words, that everybody has their role, and no one should be looked down upon to say, well, I've got a bigger role than you, or I've done more than you, and therefore it's about everybody feeling that they're pulling their weight. It's about everybody feeling that they're doing something for the people. But on the other hand, that sort of one person is not necessarily more important than the other because of what they are doing. It's everybody coming together to try and help the Jewish people on their journey and then entry into the land of Israel. And that is sort of the theme, I think, of Parashat Matot, the idea of everyone pulling their weight, the idea of everybody coming together, which I think is, you see throughout it. We saw also the story of David HaMelech, the story of King David, that this idea of dividing the spoils equally is something which was not just commanded for this particular generation who are about to enter the land of Israel, but is carried on also by David HaMelech, also by King David, and something which is important in maintaining both from a tactical perspective but also the ethical nature of the Jewish people. Any questions, comments, discussions, jokes? No one wants to tell a joke?
I'm not. I think it's nice that you have this sort of a shiur, because it really makes us think. We're not just listening. You ask.
Well, I wouldn't be able to drink my coffee if I had to talk the whole time.
Oh, I see. There's an ulterior motive.
When you spoke, not disturbing, but I was thinking about this little, what a huge thing this is, the army and going to fight. When I was in Israel now, I told you I landed up in Iraq, and obviously it's a huge drop-off point or meeting point for all the soldiers that are going with their shiva or whatever. I was emotionally...
Yeah, it's called Machane Shmonim.
These young,
We used to get
young,
dropped off.
Young people. I mean, we're not talking... I think of these biblical times, mature age writers somehow.
Well, they're very young.
So young. But these people are protecting us and our land and whatever. And this is why I'm wondering how many of them really feel, I mean, it must be so. Have that feeling of fear somewhere along the line. I don't know what they all do and where they dispatch them, but they're young. Really young. The girls especially.
Yeah, look, I think it's something which, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, they've grown up with.
Yeah.
I mean, you live in Israel, you know that's what you're going to be called upon to do. They say that the state of Israel is being protected, basically, and being saved by a bunch of 23-year-olds, because most of the Qatzinim, most of the officers, most of the officers in general in the IDF at that age, obviously the sort of higher up you go, much older, right? The chief of staff is in his 50s, but the people who are on the ground and the officers on the ground are in their early 20s. Life ahead of them, exactly.
That's why they take this year off and they go a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
I've got this granddaughter who just finished the army, and she's Australian, so she came back here, and she doesn't know where she belongs. It's like...
Well, it's interesting from a time perspective, right? That when you, and it's an interesting lesson in life that when you finish the army, also just talking a little bit here from personal experience, and sorry? Well, I was in the army for a year and a half, but many of them are there for 3 years, the girls for 2. You almost don't know what to do with all this free time, right? It's this time like, like it's wow, like I sort of wake up and I have to decide what to do with my time, and
I want to do everything.
I do not want to go and study as well.
Well, they eventually do that as well,
It's
yeah.
the interim until the studies or whatever.
No, I'm not talking about for the rest of their lives, but I'm talking about sort of when they first get out. It's a huge, and towards the end of the army, definitely those who have done it for sort of the 3 years, the last few months they actually have sort of training courses for civilian life, yes, because it's a very different, definitely, because the transition is big, and in a lot of ways, it sounds funny, but sometimes they feel like, it was easier in the army,
Yes.
at least when they first get out, right? Yeah, well, because they feel that sort of they...
Or like in Egypt.
They knew what you didn't have a choice. You knew what to do. Your sort of shelter, like where you're sleeping and what you were eating, was actually taken care of. Ironically, so it's interesting.
What these parents also go through with sacrifice.
It's amazing. Anyway, that is it for today. Thank you all for coming. No worries.
We've had our journey.
Correct, exactly.
I'd love to go back.
Tomorrow once.
But it won't happen.
Well, we'll see. Please God.
Well,